So hi again, and in this video I'm going to show you how I set up the Kubernetes cluster to run my microservices. So as you remember, my service consists of 3 microservices. So there is an event service, which basically ingests the events coming from mobile devices and stores them in Kafka. I have a stats microservice which reads the events from Kafka, calculates the aggregated statistics and stores them in the MongoDB. And I have a web service which allows you to query those aggregated statistics and return them through the REST APIs. So to run those microservices, I want to run them all in a Kubernetes. So I created the project that basically defines the Kubernetes deployments and services. I'm going to explain that in a minute. As usually, the code can be found on the GitHub. So it's under github.com artemkv kaboom-k8s. That's for Kubernetes. And let's go and look at the project, what is in. So in the root folder of the project, we have here cluster start bot, cluster stop bot, and cluster update bot. Those are the batch files. So I'm running, my host machine is running Windows, so I'm using the batch files here. So if you look in the cluster dash start bot file, we have here, we have here the commands that run my three services. So we create a deployment for the event service. We create and we define that as a service. We create a deployment for the web service and we define it as a service, and we create deployment for the stats service and we define that as a service. So if I just I will show you later how I start the script and what it does. So but let's go in those deployments and see what is there. So if I go into the event service deployment, for example, so here I have so I describe deployment that we're going to use my container image called kaboom-events-service. So that is a Docker container, and that Docker container is produced by the build. So every time I submit anything in the master branch of that project, because it's integrated with the Circle CI, the Circle CI is going to build that project and build the Docker container for that project and submit that Docker container to the Docker Hub. So and here I'm just referring to that image that is on a Docker Hub, and basically by just running this script, I'm pulling that image from the Docker Hub on my Minikube local environment, and I provide some override some environment variables, and that makes it ready to go. So that's just runs that make microservice in the container. So in this case, the environment variable I'm overriding is the Kafka broker list. So I'm connecting, basically specifying 2 IP addresses of my 2 Kafka brokers that I just described in the previous video. So this solution relies on a test environment that I set up before and I described in the previous video. And because I already have this Kafka running in a cluster, so I can just specify where to find that cluster here, and that allows this service to run. So deployment, for those who are curious, is the way of Kubernetes to basically orchestrate the lifetime of the containers. So here we can say that we want 2 replicas on of that microservice to be available in the cluster, and that's going to be and we're going to also refer to that Docker container that we have to specify which service that is. And I have this deployment for every microservice. So here I have deployment for the stats environment, and it also says we want 2 replicas of that service to run. Here I have more environment variables I need to set up, so I need to be able to connect to Kafka and to Mongo as well. But basically, so even deployments make sure that you always have those 2 replicas running. So even if one of your microservices crashes, you're going to get another one spawned by Kubernetes automatically for you. And something else that deployment allows you to do is it's basically doing the rolling update. So if you have a new version of microservice, you can just trigger a rolling update, and it will gradually replace the old versions of your containers with the new versions of your containers. And I have the cluster-update script here for that. So basically, it will just try to apply the changes in my deployments on a running Kubernetes cluster. And when I'm done with that cluster, I just run the cluster-stop and will stop all the deployments and services. So what are the services? Let's look at the services as well. The service is the way of Kubernetes to basically say how you access your microservices. So in this case, I'm saying that well, all my so if you see at the deployment, you see that my container is going to listen on the port 8600, and there are going to be two containers deployed in a cluster, and both are going to use the same port. So the question is, how am I going to connect to one of those services? I don't know where they are running because it's all hidden by the Kubernetes. So for that, basically the service is used. So I'm here defining that to access that service, Kaboom event service, on the port that is running on the port and listen on the port 8600, I just need to access the Kubernetes, any of the Kubernetes instances on the port 3600. And that's basically the way of Kubernetes to link your microservices well with the consumers. And yeah, that's basically it. So let's try to run. So here I'm in my hosting machine, so I will just run cluster start .bat, and that will basically run all my scripts and set up 3 deployments with 3 microservices and configure them to be accessible on the specific ports. So if I go and try kubectl get deployments, so I have here 3 deployments active. So I have 1 deployment for event service, 1 for stat service, and 1 for web service. And I have here 2 instances available of each service except the web deployment. I think that's just because it didn't start. So now we have 2 of each, which is what I configured. And let's go and look into the ports. So the ports are basically logical entities that run one port runs one microservice in essence. So we have here 6 ports and have 2 instances of each microservice running. So that's basically shows that my configuration was correct, and I have all the services running. And because I provided all the environment variables in my deployment scripts, so all those microservices are properly configured and linked to my Kafka and MongoDB instances that I configured in the previous video. So yeah, you have the Kubernetes cluster running on my machine here. And that concludes this video, so hopefully see you next time. Bye.